She walked like the earth owed her nothing. Slow, deliberate steps on cracked pavement that had forgotten her name just as quickly as the city had. Clara Williams, wrapped in a faded coat older than most of the people who passed her, moved through the morning haze with the kind of quiet defiance that drew no applause. Her cane tapped against the sidewalk with rhythm, not as a plea for pity, but as a declaration of presence. She moved past the closed storefronts, the flickering neon signs, the glazed stares of those too busy to care, and not one person recognized her. Not the woman who once stood on courthouse steps as riot police charged, not the voice that had thundered through church basements and courtroom halls demanding dignity when dignity was outlawed. Now, she was just an old black woman waiting for the number 8 bus on the corner of Adams and Thorne, a place where nobody waited long enough to remember. The air was thick with exhaust and indifference when the squad car pulled up. No sirens, no lights, just the slow, idle growl of entitlement. Inside, a young white officer stared at her like she was blocking a view he'd rather not be reminded of. He didn't know her name, and from the moment he stepped out, it was clear he didn't care. "Ma'am," he said, but it wasn't polite. It was barked like an order he gave a dog. Clara didn't move. She looked up, her eyes clouded from time but still sharp enough to slice through arrogance. "You're loitering," he added, hand already resting near his holster. "You need to clear the area." Her voice was calm, unbothered. "Waiting for a bus." The officer scoffed, took a step forward, and with no warning, no hesitation, shoved her. Her body jolted, her cane clattered to the sidewalk, and she stumbled back into the cold metal bench behind her. A gasp escaped from a teenage girl across the street, phone halfway out of her pocket. Clara didn't fall, but she faltered, just enough for the officer to laugh. A short, smug sound that filled the space louder than a siren ever could. The laugh was not of surprise, but of confidence. This wasn't new for him. He had done it before. He'd do it again. He turned back to his cruiser, brushing off her presence like dust from his sleeve. What he didn't know, what the city had long forgotten, was who Clara Williams truly was, what she had given, what she had endured, what she had built. What he had just struck was not just a woman, but a monument, one history had tried to erase. But history remembers, even when people don't. And now, that forgotten corner was about to become the center of everything. The squad car didn't drive away. It lingered like a dare. The officer leaned against the door, arms folded, chewing gum with a smirk carved into his face, as if Clara's silence was a joke he didn't expect to enjoy so much. She straightened herself slowly, fingers aching as they reached for her cane, the metal now scuffed and trembling in her grip. Her knees burned. The bench behind her had caught most of her fall, but the shove had cracked something deeper, a fracture not in bone but in memory, a wound made raw by the familiar sting of being treated as if her life had never mattered. He stared at her with the cold confidence of a man backed by decades of unchallenged power. "Didn't mean to rattle you," he said lazily, but his voice carried that condescending tone she knew too well, an accent soaked not in region, but in supremacy. "You people need to be careful out here. These streets don't owe you safety." Clara raised her eyes slowly. His name badge read M. Holston. She said nothing. Not because she couldn't, but because silence in that moment was the only way to preserve what dignity the city hadn't already scraped off her soul. "Nothing to say?" he asked, stepping forward again. "Thought you people always had something to shout about, marching and chanting and all that noise. But now, all quiet." He laughed at his own joke, not noticing the bus approaching from a block away. She did, but she didn't move. Not yet. He leaned in, voice lower now, more venom than mockery. "You think standing there makes you strong? I've seen your type. Loud when there's a crowd, but alone, just another shadow under a streetlight." Clara's grip on her cane tightened. Her heart beat steady, not with fear, but with something colder, older, like the part of her that had walked beside fire hoses and dogs and still hadn't broken. The bus hissed as it pulled to the curb. The door opened. The driver, black, mid-40s, froze for half a second when he saw the scene, but said nothing. Just waited. Clara stepped forward without a word, lifting her chin, her steps deliberate. As she boarded, the officer scoffed behind her. "Next time, try walking faster, Grandma." No one on the bus clapped, no one spoke, but one young man, sitting near the front, stared at her a beat too long. Not with pity, with recognition. He didn't know her name. Not yet. But something about the way she carried herself, shoulders square, eyes forward, unfolded a memory from a textbook, a documentary, a grainy photo of a woman leading chants with blood on her forehead and steel in her voice. The bus pulled away. The officer watched them go, arms crossed again, satisfied that whatever tension had boiled in that moment now belonged to the wind. He didn't know. He hadn't read the pages. He hadn't seen the film reels. He hadn't walked the roads Clara Williams had marched barefoot down when his badge hadn't even been sewn into cloth yet. But he would, because the story he thought ended with a laugh on a corner had only just begun. The wheels of the bus hummed over the cracked asphalt, a low, steady growl beneath the silence that filled the cabin. Clara sat near the back, gripping her cane like a lifeline, the bruise forming beneath her coat already throbbing in time with her pulse. Around her, passengers avoided her gaze, not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of the truth in her posture, in the way her shoulders refused to slump, despite the force that had just been used to put her in her place. The young man from the front kept glancing back, trying to place her. He recognized something. Maybe her eyes, maybe her stillness. But the years had hidden her beneath wrinkles and grey, beneath time's cruel camouflage. Clara stared out the window, but her mind was not on the streets rolling by. It was back on the corner, on the officer's hand, as it shoved her with a casual cruelty he didn't even try to disguise. She had seen that same gesture before, decades ago, in Selma, in Montgomery, in Chicago alleyways where helmets outnumbered microphones and the wrong skin tone meant a boot to the ribs, but she had never expected it here. Not at this point in her life, not when the world claimed to have changed, not after everything she'd already survived. Her breath trembled, not from fear, from fury. The officer's words repeated in her mind like an echo she couldn't silence. "You people always have something to say. You people." 2 words soaked in poison. 2 words used to separate the us from the them. 2 words that had followed her like ghosts since the day she was old enough to walk into a diner and be told she didn't belong. The worst part? No one stopped him. No one intervened. That officer had laughed, and that laughter had pierced deeper than the shove ever could, because it told her what she already feared, that this city, this so-called modern world, still saw her as less, still saw her as a problem, still looked at the colour of her skin and assumed ignorance, insignificance, inferiority. The bus came to her stop. She stood, her cane clicking softly as she moved past the indifferent rows of passengers. Her knees ached. Her pride burned. She stepped down into a neighbourhood that had changed in paint, but not in practice. Trendy cafes and artisanal shops now stood where laundromats and barbershops once pulsed with black life. The faces were different now, young, white, well-dressed, looking at her like she had stepped out of a museum and into their world uninvited. She was invisible again, or worse, offensive by her very presence. She walked slowly toward her apartment. The pain in her ribs deepened, but she didn't grimace, didn't allow herself to show weakness. She had spent too many years teaching herself how to walk proud even when her feet bled. At the corner near her building, 2 teenagers, both white, stood laughing outside a coffee shop. One looked up as she passed. "You good, Grandma?" he asked mockingly. His friend snickered. Clara kept walking. This was the new version of racism. No fire hoses, no snarling dogs, just daily humiliations, quiet and relentless. 1,000 tiny knives instead of 1 killing blow. She reached her building, climbed the stairs with slow effort, and opened the door to her small apartment. Inside, she moved past shelves lined with dusty books, old photographs, newspaper clippings, yellowed by time. She paused at a frame that hung crooked near the front door. Inside it, a black and white photo of her at 24 years old, fist raised, eyes burning with purpose. standing next to giants whose names now lived in textbooks, men and women she'd marched with, bled with, built movements with. They were gone now. And she was left to be pushed by a boy in uniform who didn't know the history beneath his boots. She sat at her table, pulled her phone from her bag, and began to dial. Not 911. Not her daughter. A different number, one that hadn't been used in years. The phone rang 3 times. A voice answered, aged and familiar. "I didn't think I'd hear from you again," the woman said. Clara stared at the photograph across the room. "It's time," she said quietly. "Time for what?" Clara's eyes narrowed. "To remind them who I am." Let's pause here for just a moment. If you're still with us, let us know in the comments. Where are you listening from? Have you or someone you know ever experienced something similar? We'd love to hear your story. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. Now, we continue. The night air outside Clara's apartment was still, but inside, the past had awakened. Clara sat in the glow of a single lamp, her fingers tracing the edge of a photograph that once graced the front page of a national newspaper. It showed her mid-speech, mouth open, eyes blazing, surrounded by a crowd of black women in Sunday hats and young men in pressed shirts, all standing against a wall of officers just like the one who had shoved her that morning. That image had once meant something. It had travelled the world. But time had made it silent. Now, no one seemed to remember the name Clara Williams, but Clara had not forgotten. She moved slowly, crossing to a small drawer beneath her bookshelf. It stuck, as always, swollen from years of weather and disuse. When it finally gave, she reached inside and pulled out a worn folder, the corners curled like autumn leaves. Inside were letters from civil rights leaders, court testimonies with her name at the top, photos of rallies, mugshots of herself from arrests that had made history before history moved on without her. She laid them out across the table like a war map, and it was. That officer had not just pushed a woman, he had pushed the weight of generations, and he had laughed, not knowing that the woman he humiliated had once stood eye to eye with police chiefs who ordered batons down on children's heads and had still not flinched. But this wasn't the 1960s. The new enemy didn't wear obvious badges of hate. They wore smirks. They hid behind policies, protected by silence and apathy. That was the racism of now. Quiet, cruel, and confident it would never be caught. Clara picked up her phone again, this time calling her granddaughter Nia. Nia answered on the second ring, her voice alert, wary. "Grandma, it's late. Are you all right?" "No," Clara said simply, "but I will be." "What happened?" "I need you to come by tomorrow. Bring your camera, and bring those friends of yours, the ones always talking about justice." Nia was silent for a moment. Then, "We'll be there." Clara hung up. Her hands trembled, but it wasn't age. It was fire. The next morning, the officer returned. Officer Halston, in his patrol car, chewing gum, window cracked just enough to show he wasn't worried about anything. Not justice, not truth, not consequences. Clara was already waiting, not alone. Nia stood beside her, camera in hand, phone mounted, live stream running. Beside Nia were 3 others, young, black, alert. They didn't chant, they didn't yell, they simply watched. Halston stepped out of the car slowly, noticing the change in the air. He looked from Clara to the camera, frowning. "What's this?" Clara stepped forward, eyes steady. "This is a memory, one you're going to regret creating." Halston smirked. "Look, lady." "My name," Clara cut in, voice like iron, "is Clara Elizabeth Williams. I helped desegregate the Birmingham courthouse. I stood on the front lines in Montgomery. I sat next to Fannie Lou Hamer when your kind said we didn't belong. And yesterday, you laid your hands on me like I was nothing. Laughed at me like I hadn't bled for the sidewalk you walk on. So now you'll stand right there while I teach you what memory means." Halston blinked. The camera didn't. Nia kept streaming. The viewers multiplied by the second. Comments flowed. "Is that the Clara Williams? Wait, this woman's a civil rights icon? Why did he put his hands on her?" The officer shifted, trying to maintain his composure, but his eyes flicked to the growing attention. He knew the department wouldn't shield him forever. Not with this. Not with her name trending. Not with the footage already circling the city. Not when a black elder was publicly standing against him with the power of history in her voice. Clara turned slightly, speaking not just to the camera but to the city watching. What happened to me happens every day to people who don't have a name, who don't have cameras, who don't have anyone. I was pushed, but I got up. Others never do. That officer didn't know my story, and he didn't care to ask. He saw my skin, my age, and assumed I was worth less than his laughter. This, she pointed to the camera, to the people watching. This is how we end that. Behind her, a car honked, then another. A small crowd began to gather across the street. It wasn't a protest, not yet, but it was witnessing. Halston backed toward his car, eyes on the phone, the crowd, the words beginning to form around him like shackles. He wasn't in control anymore. Clara turned back to her granddaughter. "We're not done," she whispered. "No," Nia said, heart pounding. "We're just getting started." The push that had knocked Clara nearly to the ground would now send a ripple through the city. And this time, the world wouldn't forget her name. The world outside Clara's apartment seemed to spin as though in slow motion, and yet she had never felt more present. The city had changed so much over the years, but she felt out of place now, even in the very spaces she once helped shape. The streets she walked were no longer filled with the same energy, an energy driven by hope and demand for justice. Now, they were full of passing faces, indifferent to the struggles that had once fueled revolutions. But today, that was about to change. Clara sat at her small kitchen table, her hand resting on the phone as her thoughts swirled. Her body ached from the shove the officer had given her, but it was the feeling of being invisible that hurt more. As she sat there, the quiet of her apartment seemed to press down on her chest, suffocating her. She was used to fighting for justice, used to standing in the face of adversity. But now it felt different. It was as if her legacy had been forgotten, swallowed by the noise of a world that didn't care to remember. It wasn't just the physical pain from the shove, it was the humiliation. To be dismissed like that, as if the years she had spent marching for equality, fighting for the rights of others, had meant nothing. The officer didn't know who she was. No one on that corner knew who she was. In their eyes, she was just an old black woman. But Clara Williams was more than that. She had been more than that. She had been there when the world first started to turn, when the very idea of equality was a fight that seemed impossible to win. She had stood alongside the giants of the civil rights movement, walked those burning streets, faced hatred and violence with nothing but a belief that things could change. And now, the world had become so complacent with its progress that it had forgotten the people who had paved the way. People like Clara, who had bled, fought, and died for the rights the younger generation took for granted. Her granddaughter, Nia, had always been there for her, but Clara hadn't wanted to burden her with this. Nia had enough of her own struggles to worry about. Still, Clara knew that the world had changed. The fight had to be fought differently now, and if she wasn't going to do it, then who would? Clara picked up the phone and dialed the number she had kept tucked away for years. It was a number that had once been a lifeline, a reminder that there was always someone in your corner, someone who believed in the cause. The phone rang twice before the familiar voice picked up. "Clara, it's been a while." Clara smiled faintly, hearing the warmth in the voice of her old friend. "It has, hasn't it? But I'm afraid I need your help." The conversation that followed was quiet, but urgent. Clara explained everything: the officer, the shove, the humiliation. And though her voice never wavered, the pain in her words was undeniable. Her friend, now an influential activist and lawyer in their community, listened intently. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer empty words of comfort. She simply listened, as she had done all those years ago when Clara was fighting the very same battles. "I'll be there," the friend said after a long pause. "We'll make sure this doesn't go unnoticed." Clara set the phone down slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time in days, she felt something close to hope. This wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't just about being humiliated in the street. This was about making sure that the fight, the struggle, didn't end with her. That the memory of everything they had fought for didn't vanish with time. That people who were still out there, still being oppressed, still being treated like nothing more than the dirt beneath others' feet, had a voice. The following day, Clara met with her friend in a small, quiet cafe on the edge of the city. They spoke in hushed tones, surrounded by the noise of the cafe's patrons, but in that room, it felt like the world had quieted down. Clara's friend had already gathered a team, young activists who had been inspired by Clara's past, who had seen her name in history books but never knew the true weight of her sacrifice. They were eager to help, eager to fight, and eager to remind the world of the people who had come before them. "Clara," her friend said, leaning forward, "you've done so much already, but now it's time for everyone to know what happened. And it's time for people to understand what this kind of treatment does to all of us. They think they can just push us aside. That's what they've done with your name, with your history. They think that because you're older, because you're black, that you don't matter anymore. But we're going to remind them. We're going to make sure they see you, all of you." Clara nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle deep within her chest. She had spent so much of her life feeling like a footnote in history. There when the fight was happening, but always pushed to the edges. But now, as her friend spoke, Clara realized that her story was far from over, and neither was the story of all those who had fought beside her. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, calls, and planning. Clara's name was brought back into the spotlight, not as a victim, but as a symbol. Her story, her true history, was being unearthed and shared across social media, on news channels, and in the streets. Clara's fight had become their fight. People who had no idea who she was were now rallying behind her, sharing her story, demanding accountability. The officer who had shoved Clara was facing mounting public pressure. He had been put on administrative leave, but the case was far from over. Clara's legal team was preparing for a formal complaint, but the damage had already been done. The truth was out, and it wasn't going away. As the media attention grew, Clara's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and grief. The city had finally begun to see her, finally began to understand the weight of her existence. But it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had been dismissed, forgotten, and trampled upon by the systems of power. Every person who had been pushed aside and laughed at for demanding to be seen. As Clara stood before the cameras during one of the public rallies, the weight of the crowd's eyes on her, she finally spoke the words that had been building within her for decades. "I've fought my whole life for equality," she said, her voice steady, yet charged with every ounce of energy she had left. "I've stood in the face of hate, and I've never stopped fighting. And I'm not going to stop now. Because when they push us down, when they think we're nothing, that's when we rise. And this time, they won't be able to ignore us." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices rising together, a collective force that Clara had not heard in so long. The system had tried to erase her, tried to reduce her to nothing, but she was standing in front of them, as powerful as ever. And this time, they weren't just watching, they were listening. Clara's life had always been about change, about fighting for a world that saw everyone as equal, regardless of their skin color, their age, or where they came from. She had fought for it in the 60s, when the streets of this very city had been lined with people whose names were etched in history as the ones who took the first steps towards civil rights. But she had done it quietly, steadily, not seeking fame, but for a world where people didn't have to endure what she had as a young woman. The world had been slow to change, but it had changed in some ways. Yet after everything she had given, after all the battles, she found herself standing in front of that officer, being shoved aside as though the decades of sacrifice meant nothing. The humiliation of that moment still burned in her chest as she walked through the halls of her building, her hand resting on the railing for support, her cane tapping softly against the floor. There was a fire inside her, though, a fire that had never gone out, even after years of feeling silenced, feeling invisible. That fire flared back to life with the quiet determination that had always marked her, and she knew what had to be done. She wasn't going to be silenced again. Not by this officer, not by the city, and certainly not by time. The next day, the storm that had been quietly gathering began to take shape. Clara's story, her name, had spread far beyond the walls of her small apartment. News outlets across the country were picking it up. The viral footage of that officer's smug laughter and the quiet, dignified way she had stood up after being pushed resonating with people. People who knew the weight of injustice. People who had seen their loved ones beaten down by a system that didn't care for them. For them, Clara wasn't just an old woman. She was a symbol. She was the embodiment of the fight they had been carrying on for generations. A fight they weren't going to let die just because it had been pushed to the edges of the public consciousness. Clara had spent so much time in the shadows, watching as her name was erased from the pages of history. But this time, it was different. This time, she wasn't going to let it happen again. Clara sat in the small chair beside her window, looking out at the streets that had witnessed so much. She thought back to the long nights when she and so many others had marched in the face of violence, when the same system that had protected people like Officer Halston had tried to crush their voices with brutality. She thought of the faces of young men and women, people who were willing to sacrifice everything for the dream of freedom and equality. Those people, like her, had endured. And now, Clara realized, it was her time again. The phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Nia, her granddaughter. She had been the one to organize everything, to make sure Clara wasn't forgotten this time. "Grandma, the crowd's growing," Nia said, voice trembling with both excitement and fear. "We've got a rally planned for tomorrow. We're getting the message out there. Everyone's showing up." "You're going to be there, right?" Clara closed her eyes, her fingers tightening around the receiver. She knew what it meant. She knew what it would cost her. "I'm not sure if I can. I'm not the woman I used to be." There was silence on the other end. Then, Nia's voice, soft but insistent. "You don't have to be. You've already done enough, Grandma. You've already changed the world. But this isn't just for you. It's for all of us. For the people who are still being silenced, who are still being hurt. It's time to remind them who you are, and remind them why we keep fighting." Clara stood from the chair, her knees aching, her back stiff, but her resolve was stronger than ever. "I'll be there," she said. "I'll be there, and we'll show them that we're not invisible anymore." The day of the rally arrived with the kind of energy that Clara hadn't felt in years. As she stood at the front, her cane in one hand and her granddaughter's arm around her waist, she couldn't help but notice the way the crowd had gathered. It was no longer just a protest, no longer just a group of people angry at the system. It was a collective force, a voice that had risen from the ashes of apathy and complacency, demanding to be heard. The streets were full of people, young and old, black and white, standing side by side. Their chants a call for justice, a demand for recognition. And Clara stood at the front, not as the frail, forgotten woman who had been pushed aside, but as the powerful symbol she had always been. The officer Halston wasn't there yet, but his absence didn't matter. It was his presence, his actions that had ignited this. And now, he had to face the consequences. Clara's voice rang out across the crowd, amplified by the speakers. "I've fought all my life for a world where justice isn't something we have to demand. But every time we think we've won, we are reminded that the fight is never over. We are reminded that we have to keep fighting, even when they tell us to be quiet, even when they push us down. But they will not silence us anymore. We will not be invisible anymore." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices rising in unison, their chants growing louder. Clara's heart swelled with the strength of it all. This wasn't just her fight anymore. This was a fight for everyone who had been ignored, for everyone who had been pushed down, for everyone who had been told that they didn't matter. And together, they were going to make sure that voice was heard. As the rally continued, the cameras rolled, capturing the faces of the crowd, the raw emotion that filled the air. People who had never met Clara before now saw her for the first time, not as an old woman, not as someone who had been forgotten, but as a leader, a warrior, a woman whose story had been erased but was now being reclaimed. When Halston arrived, his eyes widened as he took in the sheer size of the crowd, the energy that surged through the air. He knew this wasn't just about him anymore. He had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. And Clara, standing there with the force of her legacy behind her, knew that this moment was not just about one officer. It was about the reckoning that was long overdue. Halston took a step forward, the weight of his badge suddenly feeling heavier than ever. His attempts to hide the fear on his face were futile. His reputation, once protected by the anonymity of the badge, now seemed like a mask that could no longer shield him. Clara's eyes locked onto his as he walked toward her. He stopped a few feet away, his hands at his sides. A man who once thought he was untouchable, now realizing that the very system that had given him power was about to expose him for what he truly was. Clara didn't flinch. She stood tall. The crowd behind her was ready, and so was she. "You've got a choice, officer," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You can stand here and pretend that your actions were justified, or you can acknowledge the truth that's staring you in the face." The silence stretched between them, thick with anticipation. It wasn't just about an apology. It was about something far bigger, something that had been ignored for far too long. And finally, the officer understood. The people were no longer going to allow themselves to be ignored. This wasn't just about Clara. This was about a reckoning that had been too long in coming, and it was time for it to begin. The sun set over the city, casting long shadows across the streets that Clara Williams had walked her whole life. As the days passed since the rally, the tension continued to build. The public outcry had reached a level that no one had anticipated. What had begun as an isolated incident, one officer's attempt to intimidate an elderly black woman, had turned into a movement. People were talking, sharing their stories, their experiences with the police, with oppression, with being silenced for far too long. The officer, Halston, once so confident in his authority, was now the face of everything wrong with the system. But Clara knew the fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The media had descended on the case like vultures circling over a carcass. Clara's name, her story, was everywhere, on the front pages of newspapers, in the headlines of news broadcasts, and across every social media platform. People who had never heard of Clara Williams before now knew her as the woman who had stood up to a police officer, the woman whose past was steeped in the struggle for civil rights, whose legacy was a foundation on which future generations would stand. But it wasn't enough. Clara knew better than anyone that media attention, however powerful, was fleeting. The truth of what happened to her had to be acknowledged, had to be acted upon, and that meant she had to be patient, even though everything inside her wanted to rush into the fight head first. Patience had never been Clara's strong suit. She had never waited for change to come to her. She had fought for it, in the streets, in the courts, on the front lines of the movement, and this time, she would do the same. Her granddaughter Nia had become a quiet but powerful force in her corner. Nia had helped organize the rally, had managed the growing media presence, and had made sure Clara's voice was heard. But even she knew how much more work there was left to do. Clara's words, her story, had resonated with people. But now they had to turn that resonance into action. They had to force the system to answer for what it had done. Clara's phone buzzed early one morning, waking her from a restless sleep. She had barely slept the night before, her mind racing with the possibilities of what would come next. She answered the phone quickly, not bothering with a greeting. "Clara, it's time." Nia's voice came through the line, steady but filled with urgency. "The department is officially investigating Halston, but there's something more we need to do. The pressure is mounting, but we need to take this to court. It's the only way we'll get the justice we deserve." Clara's heart sank. She had known this day would come, the day when the public outcry would lead to official action. But she had also known that the road ahead would be long and difficult. "What do you need from me?" Clara asked, her voice calm despite the rush of emotion flooding through her. "We're ready to move forward, but we need your statement, your testimony. We need you to show the world what's at stake, what's been at stake for decades. We need you to stand up again. You're the face of this now." Clara paused. She could hear the weight in Nia's words, the seriousness of what she was asking, the thought of reliving the humiliation of that moment, the shove, the officer's laughter, the way the world had looked the other way. made Clara feel physically sick. But there was no turning back. Not now. Not when the world had started listening. Not when people were finally standing up, finally speaking out. "I'll do it," Clara said quietly. "But this isn't just about me, Nia. This is about all of us. It's about making sure this never happens again." The decision was made. Clara knew what she had to do, and she knew it would be the hardest thing she had ever done. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, legal consultations, and media appearances. Clara, once the quiet observer, was now at the forefront of the battle, the face of a movement that had been building for decades. The case against Halston was officially underway. The department, under intense pressure from the public, had no choice but to investigate. But Clara knew better than to believe the system would deliver justice simply because it was the right thing to do. Justice had always been something people had to fight for. It had never come easily. Clara's first day in the courthouse was surreal. The building, once a symbol of power and justice, now felt like a cold, distant place. The halls were full of whispers, the air thick with the weight of history, and the realization that, in this space, her fight was not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, for everyone who had been pushed aside. As she entered the courtroom, the murmurs grew louder. People had come to see her, to witness the woman who had stood up to an officer who had thought he could push her down without consequence. The crowd was a mix of reporters, activists, and ordinary people who had come to see justice in action. Officer Halston sat across the room, his face tight with a mixture of frustration and fear. Clara could see it in his eyes. He knew what was coming. He knew that the system he had relied on for so long was starting to crack. The very power he had taken for granted was slipping away from him, and it terrified him. The trial began, and the courtroom fell silent as Clara took the stand. She was not the same woman she had been when she first stepped onto the front lines of the civil rights movement. She was older, yes, but she was not fragile. She had lived through years of struggle, of sacrifice, and of loss. And now, she was going to make sure that her story, the story of those who had fought beside her, was heard. Her voice, steady and firm, filled the room as she began to recount the events of that day. The moment the officer had shoved her aside, the humiliation, the laughter that still echoed in her ears. But as she spoke, she didn't just tell her story. She told the story of a generation of people who had been oppressed, who had been treated like nothing, who had been told time and time again that their lives didn't matter. She told the story of those who had fought for justice, who had marched, bled, and died for the rights that others took for granted. She spoke for them, for all of them. When Clara finished, there was a long silence in the courtroom. The weight of her words hung in the air, a reminder of everything that had been lost and everything that was still at stake. The judge, a man Clara had never met, looked at her with a mixture of respect and something else, something that felt like recognition, but not quite understanding. He nodded slowly, as if finally beginning to grasp the significance of the case in front of him. But Clara knew the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The system that had allowed Halston's actions to go unchecked for so long would not change easily. But Clara wasn't here for an easy fight. She was here for the fight of her life. And this time, she wouldn't back down. The trial would continue for weeks, and the world watched as the story unfolded. Clara's testimony, her courage, her refusal to be silenced, became the turning point in the case. But it was more than just about one officer, more than just about one moment of injustice. It was about the system itself, the system that had allowed so many to fall through the cracks, to be pushed aside, to be treated like nothing. In the end, the verdict came down. Officer Halston was found guilty. His actions, his dismissal of Clara's dignity, his abuse of power, everything was laid bare for the world to see. The court's decision was not just a victory for Clara. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been ignored, for everyone who had ever been pushed aside. And it was a reminder to the world that no one, no matter how small or forgotten they seemed, would ever be invisible again. Clara walked out of the courthouse, her cane tapping against the steps, the weight of victory heavy in her chest. She wasn't just walking for herself anymore. She was walking for everyone who had ever been silenced. And as she looked out at the crowd waiting for her, She knew that this was just the beginning. The fight was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, Clara felt like the world was finally ready to listen. The courthouse loomed in front of Clara as she stood on the steps, her cane tapping softly against the marble, the sound echoing in the cool air. It was a familiar place to her. She had stood here many times before, fought for the rights of others, marched for the freedoms that seemed so elusive. But today was different. Today, it wasn't just about her past. It wasn't just about the battles she had fought in the 60s, the arrests, the marches, the days she had spent in the heat of struggle, fighting for a world where justice could be blind, where no one would be held down by the color of their skin. Today, it was about making the world see her, making the world hear the voices of those who had been silenced for so long, making the world confront the realities of racism that had been buried under layers of progress. Clara had long ago learned that progress was an illusion when it came to equality. The system, despite all the promises, had never truly changed for people like her, people who had fought for a better future and watched as the world moved on, leaving them behind. But today, Clara wasn't just a relic of the past. Today, she was a force, a reminder that the fight for justice was never truly over. The rally that had grown in momentum had shifted the tides. More and more people were paying attention, not just to her, but to the systemic issues that had allowed police officers like Halston to treat her with the kind of indifference and cruelty that had become all too familiar. The media, once skeptical, was now clamoring for interviews, eager to hear from the woman who had stood up to an officer with a badge of power, to the woman who had reminded them all of the fight that still needed to be fought. The rally had been one step, but Clara knew this wasn't enough. The public's outrage would fade, the stories would be forgotten, but the systems that allowed this to happen, those systems were what needed to be torn down. Today's hearing was a critical moment, one that would either reinforce the injustices that had allowed Halston to act with impunity or begin the long, hard road to true accountability. Clara's heart raced as she entered the courtroom. The seats were filled, the air thick with anticipation. Clara had spoken to the press many times in her life, but today felt different. Today, it wasn't just about telling her story, it was about demanding the truth be heard. Halston was already sitting, his posture stiff, his eyes downcast. His uniform, once a symbol of authority, now felt like an ill-fitting cloak, a disguise that no longer shielded him from the consequences of his actions. As Clara took her seat, she could feel his eyes flicker toward her, the briefest moment of recognition flashing across his face. It wasn't fear. It wasn't remorse. It was something else. A realization that his world, the world where he could do as he pleased without consequence, was falling apart. Clara's lawyer, a seasoned activist herself, stood up and began the case. But Clara wasn't listening to the lawyer's words. Her mind was racing, her heart pounding. This wasn't just about Halston. This was about every officer who had ever used their position to humiliate, to abuse, to destroy. This was about the culture that allowed them to act with impunity. She couldn't let it go. She couldn't let them pretend this was just one bad apple, one isolated incident. No, this was systemic, and it needed to be acknowledged. When Clara was called to the stand, the room fell silent. She could feel every eye on her, every breath held in anticipation. She stood, her cane tapping rhythmically as she made her way to the front. For a moment, she hesitated. The weight of the history she carried, the weight of the pain and the injustice settled into her bones. But then she straightened, locking eyes with the judge. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "I'm Clara Williams," she began. "I've fought for justice my whole life. I've fought for equality. I've fought for the rights of people who were told their voices didn't matter. And today, I'm here to remind you all that my voice still matters." Her words hung in the air. The courtroom was still, the gravity of her statement sinking in. What happened to me on that street corner wasn't just an accident. It wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of something much larger. It was the result of a system that has failed black people time and time again. A system that has failed to protect us. A system that has allowed people like Officer Halston to think they can treat us like we're nothing. But I'm here to tell you that we are something. We are something. and we will not be pushed aside. The room was silent, but Clara could feel the shift in the air. She could feel the weight of her words settling in. This wasn't just about her. This was about every person who had ever been treated like this. The judge, who had been sitting stoically, finally spoke. "Ms. Williams, we recognize the weight of your words, but we need to hear the specifics of the incident. What exactly happened that day?" Clara nodded. She took a deep breath, remembering the events, the officer's laughter, the way his hand had shoved her aside like she was nothing. "I was walking to the bus stop," she began, her voice calm but firm. "I wasn't breaking any laws. I wasn't doing anything wrong. But Officer Holston saw me, and he saw me as just another black woman in his way. He told me to move. I didn't respond immediately. And then, without any warning, he shoved me. He didn't just push me physically, he shoved me because he thought he could. He shoved me because, in his eyes, I didn't matter. He laughed at me. He humiliated me. He humiliated me like I was just a shadow, like I was just something that didn't belong in the world he inhabited." Clara paused for a moment, her eyes flicking to Holston. "But I'm not a shadow. I'm not invisible, and I won't be silenced." The courtroom was still. No one spoke. Holston shifted in his seat, but Clara could see the uncertainty in his posture now. He was no longer the authority in the room. The truth had already shifted the balance. "I fought for this country," Clara continued. "I fought for its promises of freedom, of justice, and I will keep fighting. I'll fight for the people who have been told they're nothing. I'll fight for the people who have been pushed aside for far too long." She looked out at the audience, at the people who had gathered to witness this moment, at the people who had been watching her story unfold. She wasn't just speaking to the courtroom anymore. She was speaking to the world. "This is not just my fight. This is our fight, and we will not back down." There was a long silence as Clara finished speaking. The weight of her words lingered in the room, in the hearts of everyone who had been listening. For the first time in a long time, it felt like the truth was finally being acknowledged. But Clara knew better than anyone that the fight wasn't over. The system would fight back. It would push back. It would try to bury the truth again. But Clara had already spoken, and now the world would have to listen. Holston's fate would soon be decided, but it wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, and powerless. And Clara Williams was done being invisible. The verdict came down shortly after, and the courtroom held its breath. Holston was found guilty. The officer who had shoved Clara aside, the officer who had laughed, who had treated her like she was nothing, was held accountable. It was a small victory, but it was a victory. Clara stood as the verdict was read, her hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from relief. She had done it. She had stood up not just for herself, but for everyone who had been pushed aside. And this time, they would not be silenced. The system had been forced to see her, and it had been forced to answer. The days that followed Clara's courtroom victory were a blur of activity. The city, once indifferent, now buzzed with recognition. Her name, once faded from public memory, was suddenly everywhere. Posters with her face appeared on lampposts, her story shared in every corner of the digital world. The world knew Clara Williams now, not just as the old woman who had been shoved aside by an officer, but as a symbol of resilience, of justice long overdue. Her granddaughter, Nia, had become the unofficial voice of the movement that Clara had ignited, speaking on panels, leading discussions, and amplifying the message that had been so long silenced. But Clara, despite her pride, kept to the shadows, watching as others carried the torch she had lit. She had never been one to seek the spotlight, but the attention was inevitable. The fight for justice, after all, was never just about one person. It was always about the collective, the voices of the forgotten, the oppressed, the silenced. Yet Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the victory, as sweet as it was incomplete. Holston's conviction was just one small piece of a much larger puzzle. Yes, the officer had been held accountable, but what about the system that had created him, that had allowed him to abuse his power? What about the others like him, the ones who operated in the shadows, protected by the silence of the very institutions that were supposed to serve and protect. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. As Clara sat in her apartment, a quiet unease settled over her. She was still haunted by the echoes of the laughter, the officer's casual mockery when he had shoved her aside. His laughter had not only been an insult to her, but to the countless others who had been treated the same way, shoved aside by a system that had learned how to do it quietly, efficiently, without ever raising an eyebrow. It was a deeper, more insidious form of violence. It wasn't just about the physical act of shoving. It was about the message it sent. You do not belong here. You are less than. But Clara belonged here. She belonged everywhere. The next day, Nia called Clara early in the morning. Her voice was urgent, filled with the energy that Clara had always admired in her granddaughter. "Grandma, there's more happening. More people are speaking up. More officers are being exposed. It's a ripple effect, and it's getting louder. We have to act. This is bigger than just Halston. The whole system is in question now." Clara listened carefully. The weight of the fight was heavier than it had ever been before, but she felt a surge of purpose. The fight indeed was bigger than one officer, bigger than one incident. This was the reckoning that had been decades in the making. "I'm ready, Nia," Clara said, her voice steady, yet filled with a determination that had been ignited in her all those years ago when she had first stood up against injustice. "Let's make sure the world sees this. Let's make them understand that this isn't just about one wrong. This is about an entire history of wrongs that have been ignored for far too long." Later that day, Nia arrived at Clara's apartment, her eyes alight with the fire of someone who knew they were on the brink of something monumental. Together, they sat at the small table, surrounded by the papers, the old photos, the memories of Clara's life. Clara looked at the images of her younger self, standing in the midst of marches, speeches, and protests. Those moments were captured in time, but they didn't feel like they belonged to someone else. They were still hers. The fight had never really ended. Nia spread out a series of documents on the table. "We've gathered a list of names, victims of police brutality who were swept under the rug, ignored by the very system that was supposed to protect them. Some of these stories have been buried for years. But now we're going to bring them back into the light." Clara felt the weight of it. These weren't just names on a piece of paper. These were lives. These were people who had been denied justice because of the color of their skin. Some had been shot in their homes, others beaten on the streets, their stories dismissed as lies, their deaths written off as tragic accidents. Clara knew what had to be done. It was time for their stories to be heard, for the world to listen. "I'm in," Clara said, her voice firm. "Let's make sure we don't stop until we've seen this through." The next weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and planning. The momentum was building, and with it, the pressure on the city's police department was growing. More officers like Halston were being exposed, some quietly reassigned, others put under investigation. But Clara knew this wasn't enough. It wasn't just about punishing a few bad apples. It was about changing the culture, dismantling the systems that allowed this to happen. The public's outrage had not waned. If anything, it had only intensified. People were demanding more. They were demanding accountability, but they were also demanding systemic change. And Clara, as much as she had wanted to fade into the background, found herself at the forefront once again. The past she had long tried to put behind her, the battles she had fought and lost, had returned with a vengeance. And now, she couldn't walk away, not when so many were looking to her for guidance. One evening, after another long day of meetings and phone calls, Clara sat alone on the small balcony of her apartment. The city stretched out before her, bright lights flickering in the distance, cars honking in the streets, people walking with purpose, as if everything were as it should be. But Clara knew better. She knew the fight was far from over. The next morning, a major development came. The police chief, under mounting pressure, called a press conference. The room was packed with reporters, cameras flashing, microphones in hand. Clara watched the coverage on TV, her heart racing. The chief stepped to the podium and began to speak, but his words were hollow. He spoke about reforms, about reviewing policies, about making changes. But Clara knew that these were just words. Words without action. Words that would fade once the cameras were gone. But then he said something that made her blood run cold. "We are fully committed to accountability," he said. "And as part of our commitment, we are reviewing all officer conduct, especially in cases involving community interactions." He paused, looking directly into the camera. "We will be looking closely at the case of Officer Holston and others who have been involved in similar incidents. We will make sure justice is served." Clara's eyes narrowed. "Justice," he said. But Clara knew the system would try to protect its own. She had seen it before. She had seen it for years, for decades. This wasn't the first time a police department had made promises in the face of public outrage. The question was, would they follow through, or would it be another empty gesture designed to quell the storm without making real change? She wasn't sure. But what Clara did know, with absolute certainty, was that this fight would not end until the system was held accountable, until the stories of those who had been silenced for so long were finally heard. And for the first time in a long time, Clara felt a sense of clarity, a sense of power that had been buried beneath years of neglect and silence. It was time for a new chapter. It was time for the reckoning to come. And Clara would be ready. The courtroom was quiet as Clara entered, her cane tapping against the hard floor with rhythmic certainty. She had walked these halls once before, many years ago, but this time felt different. The air was thick with anticipation, charged with a sense of finality that weighed heavily on her shoulders. The trial, the investigation, the protests, the rallies, everything had led to this moment. She wasn't just walking into a courtroom today. She was stepping into a battle for truth and justice that had been a lifetime in the making. The officer who had shoved her aside, laughed at her pain, was there, seated across from her, his face rigid with an expression that veiled his anxiety. Clara had seen that look before. When the system was about to be exposed, when those in power realized that their control was slipping, it wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about everything he represented: the abuse of power, the indifference to suffering, and the arrogance of a system that thought it was untouchable. Clara's eyes met his, but she didn't flinch. Her hands tightened around her cane, her posture steady, her resolve unshakable. This wasn't about retaliation. It was about reclaiming something that had been stolen from her, from everyone who had ever been marginalized, humiliated, or dismissed. It was about making them understand that she was more than a victim of an isolated incident. She was the voice of those who had been silenced, the embodiment of a fight that would not die. The judge entered, his gaze sweeping over the room before settling on Clara. His face softened slightly as he nodded toward her, but his eyes were calculating, aware of the weight of this moment. He had seen this type of case before: the power dynamics, the racial tensions, the familiar pattern of those who were supposed to serve and protect abusing their power. But something in Clara's presence, something in the air, told him that this case would be different. "Clara Williams," the judge said, his voice steady but with a hint of respect. "You may proceed with your statement." Clara stood, her knees aching, but her heart was steady. Her gaze never wavered as she looked out over the room, her words measured but filled with a quiet intensity. "I've fought my whole life for justice, for equality, for a world where people are treated with dignity, no matter the color of their skin, no matter their age, their gender, or their background. When I first started fighting, I was young, idealistic, and angry. I wanted to change the world, and I thought I could. And for a long time, I believed that the world would change with us. But as I stand here today, at this very moment, I realize that we are still fighting the same fight." She paused, taking a breath, her chest tightening. The room was silent. Every eye was on her. Officer Halston didn't just shove me on that street corner. He shoved every single one of us. He shoved every person who has been pushed aside, disregarded, treated as less than human. He shoved me because he thought I was nothing, and that is a reflection of a system that has told people like me, people who look like me, that we don't matter, that we never mattered, that we were never meant to take up space, to demand justice. But today, I'm here to tell you that I will take up space. I will take up all the space I need, and I will not be silenced again." Clara's voice echoed through the courtroom, strong and unwavering. The room, which had once seemed so cold and distant, now felt like a battlefield where the truth could no longer be denied. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for everyone who had been treated like an afterthought, for everyone who had been told to remain silent in the face of injustice. The officer, who had once been so sure of himself, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His hands fidgeted, his face flushed. The power he had wielded was now slipping through his fingers. He had thought that his uniform, his badge, would protect him from accountability. But Clara was showing him, and the world, that the time for that was over. "This case," Clara continued, "is not just about me. It's about every person who has been told they don't matter. Every person who has been crushed by the weight of a system designed to keep them down. It's about the thousands of voices that have been silenced for too long. And I'm here to say, no more. We will not be silenced. We will not be forgotten." The room was still. The judge nodded, as though absorbing the weight of her words. He knew that the verdict in this case would not just be a decision about one officer's actions. It would be a statement about the future, about whether the system would continue to protect those who abused their power, or whether it would finally begin to change. Clara stepped back, her shoulders squared, her head held high. She had said everything she needed to say. The case was now in the hands of the court. But Clara knew that, in a way, it had already been decided. The battle had already been won. The system had been forced to listen. And though there would still be fights to come, this was a victory in itself. The hours that followed were tense, the courtroom filled with hushed voices and anxious glances. People waited, their breaths held, for the final word. When the judge returned, he stepped into the room, his expression serious, his posture firm. He paused before speaking, his gaze sweeping over the room, then resting on Clara. "This court," the judge began, "has heard the testimony, seen the evidence, and considered the facts. Officer Holston's actions were unjustifiable. They were an abuse of power, and they caused harm not only to Ms. Williams, but to the entire community. This court finds Officer Holston guilty of misconduct, abuse of power, and violation of Ms. Williams' civil rights." The room erupted. Clara, her heart racing, stood still for a moment, absorbing the words. This was it. The justice she had been fighting for had been served. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't enough, but it was something, and it was a beginning. Clara's hands trembled as the reality of the verdict sank in. She had won, but the fight was far from over. There was still so much to do, so many more people to fight for, so many more systems to dismantle. But for the first time in a long time, Clara felt a spark of hope. The crowd cheered, and Clara raised her head, her gaze steady. She had done what she set out to do. She had stood up when they told her to be quiet. She had fought when they told her to sit down. And now they had to listen. The officer who had thought he could push her aside had been held accountable. But this wasn't just about him. This was about the millions of others who had been treated the same way. This was about the future, one where people no longer had to fight to be seen. Clara Williams had been shoved aside, but she was standing tall again. And she would keep standing for as long as it took. The battle wasn't over. It had just begun. Thank you for following this journey with us. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story in the comments. Have you ever experienced racism or witnessed it in your life? Your experiences are incredibly important, and we value every one of you deeply. Please don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to continue supporting these important conversations. Your support means the world to us. Wishing you all a wonderful day ahead. If you've listened to the story until the end, drop the phrase "Justice never sleeps" in the comments so we know you've made it through. Thank you for being part of this.